Imaginary friend. Troi finally gets her comeuppance for her condescending attitude towards children.
A little girl named Clara is telling Troi about what her imaginary friend Isabella is saying.
And after Clara leaves, Troi discusses her father's concerns about Isabella. He's worried that Clara isn't making any real friends, but Troi tells him not to worry about it.
The Enterprise is investigating a nebula that has formed around a neutron star. And for the 100th time, a glowing energy being of some kind enters the Enterprise unnoticed.
It flies all over the ship without being seen by anybody, and the technology must have improved since the child, because this spark looked a lot better.
Except that this time it didn't actually light up the environment around it.
Well, they didn't have a flashlight this time.
It goes to the Arboretum, where Clara is planting seeds and explaining what she's doing to Isabella.
And the spark goes inside her brain, and then suddenly a girl, purportedly Isabella, appears, and she's not creepy at all, right from the start.
Is something wrong with the way I look?
Isabella is played by Shay Astar, who I, of course, recognized from Ernest Scared Stupid.
Your highbrow film viewing, I forgot.
Yeah.
Isabella starts bossing Clara around right away,
saying she wants to explore the ship.
Geordi and Data are working with Clara's dad and talking about what to call the nebula, like they own it. When the ship supposedly hits something, even though the sensors say they didn't.
It begins slowing down, and Geordi tells Picard that something seems to be increasing the drag coefficient on the ship. And the way they use the term drag coefficient, it feels like the writer just found out what that meant and decided to say it as many times as possible to sound smart.
Clara shows up in engineering, saying that Isabella wanted to see everything, but her dad makes her leave.
And when they're out of view of the adults, Isabella reappears and says she has to be invisible when grown-ups are around.
Data tells Picard that the ship is starting to move normally again, but he can't figure out why.
They say they must have encountered some phenomenon that they've never encountered before, even though, again, this could be any number of things they've encountered before.
They're talking about it later, and they still have no answers and are debating whether or not to stick around, but they ultimately decide to do so.
Which doesn't seem very smart.
Clara asks Isabella why she's so serious and hasn't smiled, and then she does so creepily, and it reminded me of Addams Family Values when Wednesday does that.
Clara talks about how hard it is to make friends when her dad's job takes them to different ships.
And she tells Isabella what it means to be best friends. They're racing down the hallway and run into Worf, who snaps both of their necks easily. The end.
He tells them they don't belong there, but after he leaves, they run past him anyway.
Geordi's working on gathering samples from the nebula, and Clara's dad asks him what it was like growing up, as his parents also moved around a lot in Starfleet.
Geordi says he saw it all as an adventure, and believes that kids can handle more than adults think.
Which is true. In 10 Forward, Guinan, who doesn't mention any of the random shit the ship has run into that she could have helped with in the past 2 episodes, is discussing what nebula formations look like with Data.
Clara and invisible Isabella come in, and Guinan gets Clara a drink. She reveals that she had an imaginary friend as a kid.
Some sort of huge, spiky, flying alien. And I was a little disappointed that the spark hadn't flown into Guinan's brain, because that would have given this episode a way different feel.
That would have been awesome. Troi walks in and asks Clara to go for a walk with her. She says Clara shouldn't be in a grown-up place, and tries to tell Isabella the same thing.
And says if Isabella is making her do things that are wrong, she should speak up. She asks if she can talk to Isabella, and ends up looking like a dumbass.
It's not very nice to get Clara to do things that she isn't supposed to.
She's over there.
Clara says that Isabella says that Troi better leave them alone.
Later, Troi is discussing her concerns with Clara's dad, and suggests that Clara go make some non-creepy friends that are real, and that her dad start being more involved in her life.
Isabella apologizes for getting Clara in trouble, and says she doesn't like grown-ups and wishes they would go away.
She gets mad at Clara for not wanting to go back to engineering and always doing what those fucking grown-ups want.
Troi interrupts to take Clara to a ceramics class, but she says Isabella can't come.
Which Isabella is totally fine with.
And the ship begins experiencing the same drag coefficient effects as earlier.
But again, there's nothing there. And Picard weirdly suggests that they go to warp, which seems like a really dumb idea, but Data thankfully shuts him down.
Geordi and Clara's dad discover that some strands of plasma are interacting with the warp field to increase the drag coefficient. Or they could be interacting with the shields. They say both as if they are the same thing, but they're not.
Good point. The drag coefficient on the science of this episode was increasing. Troi and Clara arrive to the ceramics class, where she's introduced to Alexander, which I thought was pretty cool. I did not expect him to show up as a one-off side character in this episode.
I agree. And he is making a cup out of clay for his dad. Up on the bridge, Geordi generates a larger warp field in order to detect the plasma strands around them.
And once they see it, all this majestic music plays, but it reminded me of when you teleport through hell in Doom 3.
Remarkable. It is an irregular lattice composed of approximately 47 million strands of energy.
Picard finally decides they should get out, which of course they should have done a long time ago.
Troy's alone in her quarters when her cup of hot chocolate gets knocked over by itself and she's weirded out. But the ship has run into stuff twice in this one episode. Things will be getting knocked over all the time. Alexander and Clara are getting to know each other better and don't seem concerned that there's a facehugger egg right in front of them.
When Alexander walks off, Isabella knocks over his cup, and he ends up blaming Clara for it, saying he spent 2 weeks on it. 2 weeks on this misshapen grotesquerie of a clay object.
2 weeks.
Oh, I didn't think about that.
Boom. Got it.
And Alexander says there's no such thing as invisible people. I guess no one told him about Identity Crisis.
Isabella starts being a bitch and causes Clara to run away, and then Isabella says she'll die along with everyone else, which reinforced my suspicion that the Enterprise had indeed entered hell. The ship is running into more and more plasma strands, essentially getting caught in a web, and this time Riker suggests going to warp, which was still a dumb idea.
Troi talks to Guinan in 10 Forward, where she expresses her doubts about trying to pry Clara away from her imaginary friend.
And Guinan relays her story of her own paranoid delusions about her spiky alien friend, when Clara's dad asks Troi to come by, saying that Clara is terrified by Isabella.
Clara tells Troi that Isabella said that others like her will come and kill everyone.
And Troi tries to comfort her and show Clara that there's nothing to be afraid of, and it was great because you knew Isabella was going to appear and zap the hell out of Troi, which she does.
She wakes up in sickbay, where she talks about seeing Isabella.
And Clara's dad tells Picard about Isabella's threats.
Picard tells Worf to keep an eye out for Isabella, who he mentions having seen before.
And the ship runs into so many strands that it can't move anymore.
And they pick up an energy being coming toward them that seems to feed on their shields.
They can't counter it, and more of the entities start attacking them, and they have less than 10 minutes, which was refreshing from their usual 5 seconds.
Picard goes with Clara to talk to Isabella.
And Isabella reveals that she came on the ship to determine if the Enterprise was a threat, and to feed on the ship's energy.
When Picard says they can provide energy in other ways, Isabella still says they deserve to die because of how cruelly they treated Clara.
Picard realizes that Isabella is viewing all events and people from a child's point of view, and explains how humans raise kids and how much they care for them. It was a little reminiscent of the bonding with Jeremy and his mom alien.
Clara tells Isabella she still wants to be friends, and Isabella smiles and leaves. The strands disappear, and Picard orders Geordi to shoot an energy beam at the Nebula to feed these dangerous beings.
Demons. And we close with Isabella apologizing to Clara for not being a good friend, but not for zapping the hell out of Troi.
And they both say they hope they'll see each other again, so I can't wait to see them hanging out with Jeremy in a future episode.
Imaginary friend. Overall?
This episode could have been a lot worse, but it definitely wasn't great. Despite being mostly one simple story stretched out over the episode, the drag coefficient never made it feel too tedious for me, but by the time it was done, it felt pretty pointless. The main cast is just kind of involved at the fringes of the actual story, and they did try to add some depth to Clara and her father, but it didn't end up amounting to much. The alien literally thinking like a child didn't make a lot of sense, nor did its tactics for how to study the Enterprise, nor did its friendship with Clara, an alien being of a completely different type. I liked that Alexander showed up without being directly related to anything with Worf. That was cool, but that didn't really go anywhere either. I didn't hate this episode. Focusing on kids could have gone really wrong. I thought that aspect of it worked okay. It was just the alien stuff and the explanation for everything that was very by the numbers, and things wrapped up in a way that made it feel completely unimportant and forgettable. I gave it a C-.
Yeah, me too. I will point out there have been a lot of kid-centric episodes this season, which is an interesting choice. I thought the girl that played Clara did a good job, and the girl who played Isabella did a good job of being a creepy alien bitch. The ending was not satisfying, and the fact that this huge problem was solved in 3 sentences was pretty lame. I think it's interesting that we get a lot of Geordi's backstory in conversations like the one he had with Clara's dad. This is not the first time that's happened. It's interesting how much we get to know about him in episodes that really have nothing to do with him, like in Hero Worship when he was talking to Data. I don't really have much to say about this one. It wasn't bad, but I agree that the premise went on for a little too long, and there wasn't much payoff. But it was cool to have Alexander show up for just a few minutes. It gave the show a little dash of extra continuity. For as strong as the season has been, this episode added to the drag coefficient a little bit.